So today we begin a month with Gary Zhukov's classic spiritual book, Seat of the Soul. And I really encourage you to visit or revisit this during the course of this month if it's something that you're interested in. It's one of the classic books. It's probably about either the second or the third spiritual book I ever read in my new awakening. I probably read this, I'm not sure if I read it before The Science of Mind or right after I'd first been introduced to it. But at our center in Fort Lauderdale, was back in 89 or 90, they were doing a lot of stuff on this, so I read the book fairly early. And I'm rereading it, it's kind of interesting because it's been, 24, 25 years since I read it. And it's a different book now. Well, no, it's not. It's the same book. I'm different. And I disagree with a lot of stuff in it. Not a lot, but some. Whereas before when I read it, it was kind of like, oh, because there was nothing, I didn't have any basis really to understand a lot of the things that were put forth in the book at the time. I was pretty new to the idea of metaphysics and to the idea of creating your own reality with your thoughts and things like that. I had... as most of you know, I was raised Catholic, and as soon as I got out of high school, that ended. So I was pretty much a secular person for most of my early adulthood into middle age. So I hadn't thought about this stuff a lot. Anyway, I thought how many have read the book, either back then or now? Quite okay. See how many. So very popular certainly in our circles. If not, you may know Gary from being on, he was on the Oprah show 36 times. Yeah, interesting guy. I've seen him in person a couple of times. He's a total introvert. He has to be dragged out of his place up in Mount Shasta where he lives. In his the intro to the new book, he talks about that. He says, when Oprah wanted to see him after she read the book, and he didn't have a TV and he didn't know who she was. She called him and she says, "Hi, my name's Oprah." He goes, "How do you spell that?" She goes, "Oprah," and the H is silent. He had no idea who she was, and ended up going on the show reluctantly. And if you've seen him on the show, he's not the most comfortable person in front of an audience, and I've seen him live. We had him in Fort Lauderdale a couple of times. Kind of interesting. Anyway, he's a brilliant guy, but very much kind of an introverted, off the grid kind of a personality. The first section of the book's divided into 4 sections. The first section is called Introduction, and it has 4 chapters, and these are the chapters in the first section. Now, we're not going to be able to go through all of it, so what I find when I do this kind of thing is I read through it and see what resonates and kind of narrow in. So we're going to mainly focus on the chapter on karma during this talk, but there's lots of good material throughout. Then I'm going to talk about one piece from the first section where he talks about reincarnation, which he's a firm believer in and has some pretty specific information about it that when I first read it, I thought, that's interesting. When I read it now, it's like, how does he know all this? Because to me, there's some things in there that he's putting forth as fact, and he doesn't really spend a lot of time backing up what he says. He also does almost no personal experience. He tells stories about other people, but not so much about himself. Anyway, so I thought what I would do in terms of reincarnation is put up a statement by Dr. Holmes. This is from the 1926 edition of the Science of Mind textbook, which was the first edition. This was taken out of the second edition. I'm sure it had nothing to do with anything other than space. But anyway, it says, "The spiral of life is upward. I do not believe in the return of the soul to another life on this plane. Evolution carries us forward, not backward. Eternal and progressive expansion is its law, and there are no breaks in its continuity. I can believe in planes beyond this one without number in eternal progress. I cannot believe that nature is limited to one sphere of action." So this sort of summarizes, and there are other places in his writings where Holmes wrote about Actually, this was also reprinted in the Science of Mind magazine in the 1990s. But his sense was, well, people would say, well, what about memories people have of past lives? That are often used to explain the idea of reincarnation, where a kid will have a memory and you'll take them, and there's been examples of where the kid goes to a house and sure enough the whole story is going on there. And Holmes's response was that doesn't necessarily mean that those are that child's own memories. He said it's just as likely, in fact more likely, when he says when you get back, and Zukov actually talks about this, when you get back out of the physical plane, which we exist to a large extent beyond the physical plane, but beyond the physical plane there's no time and no space. That doesn't exist. He even talks about, in terms of reincarnation, that all the lives are happening simultaneously, in his view, which is actually the earliest writing I found out about was the Seth material, which was a channeled series of books that were out in the 70s and 80s and so forth. But so that basically your soul exists outside of space and time, and there's kind of a wheel of existence that are all unfolding at the same time, and it's not like one life affects the next life in time. They're all affecting each other simultaneously, which is way too confusing for me to figure out. What Holmes says is that we have access to all thought, or any human thought that's ever been thought, we can access. And he said that's basically what psychics do. Psychics have are able to tune into this field of thought that exists, but they're not their own thought. So, which is why the world of psychism is often called the world of confusion, because you may get the thought, but you don't understand it necessarily the way the person who originally thought it did. Does that make sense? I've told the story before. When I was in law enforcement, we worked with many psychics, and one particular I became very good friends with. And her style was, her name was Noreen Renier, and she lived in Orlando, and we would send her a piece of clothing or an object that the victim of a crime had in their possession right before or right at the time of disappearance or death. And she would hold that object and experience what they experienced, and then she'd tell us what happened and who did it. She'd tell us what they looked like, because she didn't know the people, because it wasn't her experience. But she would, she pointed us to bodies that we found and things like that. And I said, how do you do this? She goes, I don't know. It's just something I can do, but I can't do it unless I have the object. And I saw her actually do that many times, including an object that I was in a group like this, and I gave her out my object, and she said something about me that nobody else knew. So Holmes would say, actually, what we describe as these reincarnation past life experiences are actually similar to that, in that we're picking up thought forms from people who lived, but they're not necessarily ours, which is why we often don't understand them fully. Who knows, is the answer, So Holmes would say, in theory, everything should go forward. Why should the soul kind of get stuck here a lot of times? And if you look at it theologically, where we get the concept of reincarnation most embedded in theology is in the East, in Hinduism and Buddhism and so forth, where they say it takes 1,000 lives or 10,000 lives to reach nirvana. And my sense on that, and many theologians' sense on that, is that's sort of the Eastern version of original sin, trying to explain why human beings are flawed. So original sin, which by the way came way after the time of Jesus as a real theologically accepted concept, says you showed up flawed, you got one shot to get it right, but you start off with one foot in the hole because you showed up because of this original sin concept. Whereas in the idea of needing many, many lifetimes to become enlightened, it's sort of the same idea. How do we explain why people are so messed up? Why is life so hard? Why is it so difficult to get it right? So if you can kind of see the logic behind both systems. One is we showed up screwed up. The other one is we showed up exactly as we were supposed to be, but it's going to take 10,000 years of refining to get us to the point where we're ready to go to the next level. very similar kind of an origin to those ideas. And Holmes said, no, I don't think so. I think you, and he expands on this quite a bit. He thinks we do carry forth memory. He thinks we do carry forth a sense of what we've experienced, but we go to the next plane, whatever that is. It may be physical, it may not. Nobody knows. And you show up at the next plane as prepared as you're going to be for the next plane. Just like you showed up here, as prepared as you're going to be for this experience. So, I don't know. I'm a firm agnostic about really about reincarnation. It may be so, as it's described. It may not. Both of my kids had these early life memories of when they were a different girl, and they were, talked about that. I don't know. And we don't know. But in terms of the understanding of the teaching and the philosophy, Dr. Holmes is always consistent with that. He says, no, that wouldn't make sense. It would make sense if it was this way. And he says, we don't know. Until we have proof, it's just conjecture. So you can take whatever conjecture makes you feel the best, but we just don't know. I want to talk a little bit more about karma. And he says here, every action, thought, and feeling is motivated by an intention, and that intention is a cause that exists as one with an effect. If we participate in the cause, it is not possible. That's not right. It is not possible to participate in effect. We have to, I think I have a word out of there. We have to participate in the effect. So in other words, whatever karma is actually seen in the East as starting now and going forward. It's a form of logic. Karma does not, in the East, does not focus on what you did before that's happening now. It begins now, because now is the only place you can act. So in effect, you could extrapolate to say, oh yeah, well then what I did before is what's causing my issue or my glee now, and yeah, that would be true, but there's nothing you can do about that. You can only act in the now, and karma, as it's used in the East, is irrevocably attached to action. It means to act. So when I act now, I'm generating my next experience. And I cannot avoid that experience. I have to be part of whatever experience I set in motion. And we do that not only individually, but we do it collectively. You do it within your family. You co-create the family experience, each one having their own version of that, but it's co-created together out of the consciousness and intention and feelings and actions of everyone involved. And you do that in a community like this. You do that where you work. We do that as a nation. We do it as a planet. So the idea is that we continually move forward. And in this most profound way, we are held responsible for our every action, thought, and feeling. We ourselves shall partake of the fruit of our every intention. So this is, you might say, the universal concept of responsibility and accountability. That I can't, whatever I'm thinking about, which is cause to my effect, will lead to ultimately to that effect, and that's what I get. I get the ultimate consequence of the intentions I set into motion. Now, I didn't know about this for most of my life. Actually, I'm getting to the point where I did know about this for most of my life, but that's another story. But I didn't know about this for most of my life. I thought, if you looked at my cosmology as I grew up, the essential thing was life happened and you reacted to it. Stuff happened to me. I met people who did things or didn't do things, and I had to learn to cope or respond or react to that. I didn't get that I was really a creative agent in all of that. I didn't get that I was the absolute creative agent in how I dealt with whatever went on in the world around me. And I would absolutely believe that, hey, I'm doing the best I can. There's nothing I can do. What do you do? What are you going to do? All that stuff. You buy into kind of whatever the cultural law of averages is in terms of how we see the world and what we expect from it. The elders tell you what to expect out of life based on what they've experienced and based on what the expectations that were passed on to them by the elders, and not just your parents, but teachers and just coaches and friends and the people on TV and the authors you read and all that. And early in my life, as far as I'm aware, nobody was saying anything to me that other than I had to be, the closest it got was I had to be strong. I had to be strong because the world demanded strength. But that wasn't necessarily portrayed as a creative element. It was more of a reactive element. So that was my upbringing. And I'm sure there's a whole cross variety of stuff like that. But then when I ran into this teaching through Wayne Dyer, reading one of his books, one of his early books, I began to get this sense that, wait a minute, maybe I do have some say in what goes on. And coincidentally, at the time in the police department, they started using this program. It was called Investment in Excellence by a guy named Lou Tice up in Seattle. And it was all about self-image psychology and visualization and things like that. So I began, and Lou worked with a lot of corporations. He worked with a lot of top elite sports teams and Olympic athletes to help them to visualize their way to success, was kind of what his focus was. And I began to learn that at work while I was getting involved with reading Wayne Dyer and finding the Science of Mind Center in Fort Lauderdale and things like that. And I'm very grateful that this was coming at me from more than one direction, because for me it was a big hurdle to learn to accept a different way of looking at myself and the world. And it's one I'm sure everyone in here has faced at some point in your life, unless you were raised like this. So you start to think, well, wait a minute. The first thing that happened to me was I was confused. And the second thing was I got really angry that I didn't know this earlier. Because you flash back to all the times you suffered by not knowing that you had you could have made different choices. You could have, recognized that, yeah, that kind of hunch or idea I had was really, if I'd have followed that, everything would have been different and all of that. You go through that phase. I call it buyer's remorse, where you kind of regret. And then you get into the place of, okay, all right, that's behind me. Now I can move forward and start to implement some of these ideas, mostly in a testing mode to see if they really worked. So my first exposure to this, again, was pretty secular in the sense that it was through this program at work, and I used it in softball. I was in the softball league, and it starts talking about how do you think, and the way I would think was like this. I used to bat. It was slow pitch softball, so it's like, it wasn't like my life was in danger or anything. And but in slow pitch softball, if you have a batting average of less than like 350, you're not very good, because they're just kind of lobbing the ball up there, But there are 10 fielders, so it's but I was around 300 hitter, so I was like batting 9th or 10th. And I played second base, and I remember what my MO at second base was: don't hit the ball to me. I'd be out there, okay, come on, and inside I'm going, don't hit it to me. I don't want to make an error. And when they hit it to me, a significant percent of the time I made an error. Or I picked up the ball and threw it into the stands, or anything. And I didn't see any connection. See, I thought my thoughts made sense in reaction to that. I didn't recognize that my thoughts were actually creating it. And I was getting up to bat, if it was the end of the game and we were losing and there were 2 outs, I go, oh great, I get to make the last out as I'm walking to the plate. That was just where I was. That's how I thought about things. So I started writing affirmations for softball. And it was things like, I'm a great hitter, and I'm eager to be the one at bat with the game on the line. And I would just visualize that and feel what that would, picture like a scene from The Natural or something, and then, when I'm at second base, I'm an excellent fielder, and I want the ball hit it to me every time, because I'm absolutely dependable. And I would just visualize that over and over. And in the course of a few weeks, because when I started doing this, I was between leagues. I had about 6 weeks. And I did that visualization for like 6 weeks. In the new league, which was, 30 games or something, I hit like 800 and I didn't make a single error. And I went from batting last to batting first. and nothing else changed. So I'm sitting there going, no, it couldn't have been this easy my whole life. Really? You know, and again, I went back into anger because I could have been doing this my whole life. You know, and I would think back, how did I get the other way? And I remember when I was a little kid learning to play, my father would say, don't miss it. You know, it was the reinforcement I got that I learned to give myself was always don't screw up. And you know, the problem is, the psychology is when you say don't screw up, the only thing that gets through is screw up. So I was actually doing exactly what I was coached to do, which was be mediocre. So that was karma too, see? So if you're going to change your karma, it means I'm going to make a new direction in how I think about things and how I approach things and what I will entertain and accept as possible. Because the existing situation, if I'm dissatisfied with it, that dissatisfaction is the first step in making a change. But many of us never get out of that step. We just stay dissatisfied. The second step is actually beginning to think in a new direction consistently. You know, more and more, usually initially we can't do it consistently, but over time you learn to do it more and more and more consistently. And you are held, the same thing happens. We partake in the fruit of our every intention. Whether that intention is to soar or to crash, or to kind of be unhappily in the middle. We have to, that's the consequence. So cause and effect, when we talk about cause and effect, that's what we're talking about. So karma, the healthiest way to view karma, I think, is to say, what am I doing now to create the future that I really desire? Not worrying about how I got where I am. I mean, you can do that, but it's not even that helpful in many cases. Sometimes it is, because you're really stuck. But in most cases, like with the softball thing, I didn't need to go to therapy. You know, I needed to change the way I thought and do some affirmations on a specific time. I did them twice, 2 or 3 times a day. I had cards with them written on. I did it systematically because that helped me to make sure I would do it. He says, a personalized statement of karma would be, you receive from the world what you give to the world. And again, don't just think, what many people think is a linear connection between behavior and response. And it's not, it's more than that, because most of the action is happening beneath the surface. You know, we see people that do horrible things and get away with it, or even get rewarded by it. Or we see people that do wonderful things and don't get the accolades we think they deserve, and we say, well, karma doesn't work. But see, we don't know what's going on in the subconscious and subjective mind of these folks, or in the cultures and subcultures in which they're operating. It was a big thing. We were doing this kind of training back. I was, working in Miami, and you'd ride around and you'd be in a really, really bad neighborhood, and all of a sudden there'd be like a house that looked like it belonged on Malibu Beach that would take up 3 lots and be 3 stories high and all marble, and there were 5 or 6 Lamborghinis in the front yard. And these were 25-year-old drug dealers that owned this house. And the cops would get really pissed off. Jesus, I can't believe, look at that. Look what that person does, and look how they're living. And I felt that way too, and I began to really pay attention. I said, yeah, look how they're living. What do you mean? I said, well, you notice there's 4 or 5 guys walking around the yard with Rottweilers. You notice there's cameras all around the place. These guys are in fear of their lives every day because they have enemies, not just the legal system. Matter of fact, the legal system was the least of their problems. See, but if you don't take that into account, you say, well, gee, yeah, but they're still living in a great house. Yeah, they're living in a great house, but they're living in fear. How much are they enjoying that house? And even if they are enjoying the house, what's to be upset about? Why am I making that a big deal in my life? Why am I obsessing over whether or not someone else is getting the proper consequences according to what I think they ought to get? I'm making my own karma to suffer because I'm deciding to judge everybody else. I saw an ad in the paper for captain of the world, and I sent in an application, and I got accepted. So now I have to worry about everybody in the world and make sure they're shaping up, right? Karma is not a moral dynamic. Morality is a human creation. The universe does not judge. When we confuse karma with human morality, we make a mistake, because karma has nothing to do with morality. All morality can be an element of how you set intentions. Karma is simply the mathematics of the intentions becoming actualized. That's all it is. Hitler was pretty good at setting intentions. Not ultimately, because ultimately he ended up where anyone who takes that path will end up, in self-destruction. When you set up a path of destruction, you become part of the destruction. See? But you could say, in terms of setting intentions, he was pretty good. Demented, but good. You go to the other side of the equation, you have people like Mother Teresa and Martin Luther King and Gandhi and other people we look up to, who set the intention to be a difference in the world in a positive way. Many in a disruptive way. And guess what? They ended up kind of like Hitler in some respects. Not living out their full lives. Well, Mother Teresa did. See? Because they put themselves into an arena in such a consciousness that said this is part of the expectations. So is it equally moral that Hitler died and that Gandhi died? No, it's a completely different moral issue. Karmically, it makes sense. Because karma doesn't have a moral component. So you want to have a moral, ethical component to your life and how you set intentions. But that doesn't bear on the karmic action, if that makes sense. The karmic action will occur anyway. It's like I can use the electricity coming into the room to light the light or run an electric chair. The electricity itself doesn't know, doesn't care. So you might say the moral component exists somewhere in that end device within us, but the action of how it works is the same. So the karmic part is like the electricity coming through the walls. It's available to anything that will conduct electricity. The energy going through a human being is available to any human activity. We decide whether we're on a moral, ethical path or not. But the karmic outcome isn't tied to that morality, it's tied to the karmic energy itself. This is something that's sometimes hard to get, because we want things to be moral and ethical. Isn't that the highest order of the universe? Well, there isn't really a lot of evidence to that if you take the whole universe into account. I mean, perfectly good planets and stars blow up all the time. You see, and out of that maybe gets created greater opportunity for something new, but is it moral or ethical if someone or something was living on that planet? If our planet were to blow up tomorrow, and out of that explosion, new elements were created that were then propelled through space and helped create a whole new form of life on another planet, you might say that karmically, that's perfect. Morally, from our perspective, it was cruel and inhumane. So morals and karma aren't necessarily the same thing. Ideally, we practice with a moral and ethical center, but if we don't, the karma still works. Either way, it works. Personalities in interaction, he says, are souls that are seeking to heal. This is where another area where I'll just share very quickly. I think he's a little inconsistent because he taught the way he defines the soul, and I think this is an important concept. On one hand, he defines the soul as being absolutely perfect, apart from any effect of any of our physical experience in life. And that's what Ernest Holmes would say. And then he says the soul can be fragmented, and it can need to heal. So I think he's talking about two different things, but calling it all soul. I would just make a point of clarification here that I believe the soul, or what we would call our ultimate spiritual identity, is untouched by our human experience. It is infinite. It is separate from time and space. And the parts of us that need to heal are a little further down the pathway into our individualized selves. What needs to heal is our personality. What needs to heal is our capacity or our ability to bring ourselves into alignment from conscious awareness through subconscious mind into that deepest knowing, that deepest soul sense. The soul sense is fine and pure, but it gets distorted as it moves up through our system because we accept things that aren't true. We inherit, and I think initially our human nature, our animal nature, distorts some of that. If we don't develop the capacity to be wise and to learn and things like that, we express much less than our capacity or possibilities. But at the same time, in the process of learning, sometimes we distort. I give an example like this. You ever had a glass of soda water where the bubbles are coming up all the time, right? So imagine that your consciousness is that glass of carbonated water. And the bubbles are released from the bottom, and if they come straight to the top, it's perfect. But what we do is we put ice cubes in it. And the ice cubes are limited beliefs. And as the bubbles move up, they get attached to those limited beliefs, and they don't get to the top exactly the way they were released. They get distorted. Some of them don't make it at all. And we end up having an awareness from within that is less than complete. So part of the spiritual journey is aligning or cleansing that interior pathway so that we're better able to connect with that deep intuitive knowing. Okay, but I do agree that we do that largely through interacting with other personalities. That's where we have the opportunity to look at ourselves, to learn and grow, to get information that causes us to self-reflect, or experiences that cause us to self-reflect. He talks about the idea of non-judgmental justice as being one of the desired outcome of an understanding of karma. He said, what made, I'll just say the thing here. Non-judgmental justice is a perception that allows you to see everything in life, but does not engage your negative emotions. It relieves you of the self-appointed job of judge and jury because you know that nothing escapes the law of karma, and this brings forth understanding and compassion. So he talked about Jesus as an example of this, Gandhi as an example of this, of being able to look at discord in the world and not be emotionally dragged into it. Because they were able to recognize that, you know what, it's all going to work out, maybe not in my lifetime or my knowing, but I don't have to get emotionally involved in a negative way out of fear or anger or any of that, because I just need to observe it and then influence it to the degree that I can, and I can do no more. So to live an internally peaceful life, this would be a prerequisite. It's when we can't stand the behavior of others, and why is it? Because we tend to feel threatened by it. That's the main reason. At some level we feel endangered by it. So the outcome of a fuller understanding of the law of karma would in part be, I can live in peace and compassion because I don't need to judge you. I don't need to be responsible or accountable in any way for how you behave. And even if I have an accountability, even if, let's say, I'm paid to be your boss in some setting, I still don't have to get emotionally involved in dealing with the issues. I can just deal with the issues according to whatever my role is. I can say, I'm sorry, you're going to have to write you up. When I was a cop, I used to have to write people up or cause them to be suspended or even fired. And I can tell you, it wasn't like it was fun, but I never took it personally. I can say this, I never took it personally in terms of this was somehow an offense against me. And I think that's kind of what he's talking about here, is simply the capacity to be in non-judgment. And karma, he says, karma at the highest level, the universe doesn't judge. And judgment simply being, here's what judgment is. Judgment isn't the same as discernment. Judgment is when I lead with my emotions, not with my wisdom. Judgment is where I feel a negative experience about something and then I put my intellect behind it. Discernment is where I say, okay, is this something I should be around or not be around? Is this something where I need to speak up or I should keep my mouth shut? Coming from a place of wisdom, which is not driven, wisdom is not it comes from the heart, but it's not primarily driven by the emotion. Because see, my emotions are tied to my current beliefs, and if my current beliefs are fear-based, my emotions will tend to take me in a fear-based direction all the time. My teacher used to tell me, my first teacher, Dr. Bill, used to say, if you follow your emotions, you'll go straight to hell. He said the spiritual pathway is learning and developing character is learning to bring your emotions in line with the higher levels of thought. And for most of us, that takes training. So when we talk about judgment, we're not talking about the same thing as making a choice. See, I may recognize that someone is toxic in their behavior. I can discern that, and I can make a discerning choice to say, you know what, I'm going to choose not to be around that person. I'm going to choose not to have them in my experience of life, and that may require a difficult conversation. Or may not. Maybe I can just ignore them. But maybe I have to say, you know what, I can't be around. I've had some conversations like this on Facebook. Before I defriend you, I have a conversation. And the reason is always the same. It's toxic, and I don't see any redeeming value in it. And there's nothing I can put in the comment line that's going to help. And it keeps happening. So I'm done. I'm not throwing a fit. I'm not, having an emotional breakdown. I'm just saying, I don't need this. And I hold you harmless and wish you well. But you're not going to be around me anymore, at least not in this forum, That's not being judgmental. That's being discerning. We have to discern. We have to use our wisdom to choose what's the best information, what's the best news sources in the world today. Who can we trust? Who can't we trust? Or actually, who can we trust to be for us and who can we trust to be undependable? It's always about trust. So all of that is karma, in the sense of how I'm acting, thinking, and creating my consciousness now is determining my experience in the next time frame, whatever that is. Day, week, month, year, lifetime. So this, I think, is a very important chapter, and I think he does a really nice job with it. The other chapters on reverence and heart are also brilliantly written, and they actually carry forward this idea of how do we emotionally deal with the karmic results that we get and some of the difficult choices we need to make. Okay, so next week we'll go into section 2. I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you, and namaste.